This week's podcast is an interview with Dave Watson from Ford and Steve Bishop from IDEO discussing the risk, challenges, and successes from co-innovation projects. In this podcast, Dave and Steve talk specifically about the collaboration between Ford and IDEO that resulted in the creation of the Ford Fusion Smart Gauge. Enjoy.
This is the Killer Innovations Podcast with Phil McKinney. Keep in mind that the information and opinions expressed in this podcast are Phil's, and Phil's alone, and they don't necessarily reflect those of his past, current, or future employers. Now, here's Phil McKinney.
So today on the Killer Innovations Podcast, we're here with Dave Watson from Ford and Steve Bishop from IDEO to talk about the collaboration that Ford and IDEO worked on for the development of the Ford Fusion Smart Gauge, and the work that really happened from the standpoint of the collaboration. So, Dave, Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So, Dave, why don't you start off and give us a little background on, this effort that Ford was driving with regards to delivering kind of a new experience in the car when it comes to your hybrids.
Sure. So, as you may be familiar, Ford had the Escape hybrid out for a while, and Ford had done several different kind of customer experience events with that. One in particular brought a bunch of people into Dearborn, Michigan, and had them drive their Escape hybrids in and kind of gave them the opportunity to interact with the engineers that actually had worked to build the vehicle. And there were some really eye-opening experiences there.
So has Ford done that before? I mean, have you guys invited customers to come in like that, or is this something?
Yeah, I think it's something that has been done in various forms, in various ways. I think traditionally it's more the domain of the marketing departments. I think actually having real engineers out in front is not as common. But I think particularly because hybrids are such a new thing, and it was such an innovative project to do that originally, I think there was a lot of desire for the engineers to kind of see how customers were really experiencing it and really give them some insight into how people were using their vehicles and kind of interacting with them. So it was a great opportunity for the engineers, and I wasn't directly involved in that, but some of the other people on our team were. And one of the things that came out of that was that the hybrid customer was really kind of different. They Especially at that point, right? These are a lot of first adopters. So they had some pretty interesting ways of interacting with their vehicle. A lot of people who had spreadsheets of their fuel economy, and they, paid a lot of attention to things, and they were really looking at all the very detailed minutia of how the vehicle operated and trying to tweak the last, bit of efficiency out of them. And I think, kind of internally, we recognized that there was an opportunity to do something better in terms of satisfying this kind of information desire out of it. And so, we had done some work internally to kind of come up with some ideas. And it was, I think in the end, compared to what we came up with, it was like a bunch of engineers sitting around trying to predict what they would want, trying really hard to listen to the customer. But I think in the end, it was very much more of an engineering effort than a customer observation or understanding effort. And I think at some point there was a recognition that we could do something better, and we kind of brought IDEO in at that point to kind of say, let's turn this into a real project. Let's really try to get inside the minds of customers and to really do something groundbreaking and really innovative. For the Fusion Hybrid, the desire was to not just come out with a new vehicle, but to come out with something really that would kind of leapfrog the current technology that was out there. So kind of went to IDEO to kind of get that help to be really far out there rather than just kind of incremental improvement over what we had done in the past.
So, Steve, everybody kind of has their perception of IDEO, particularly, for people who've never worked with IDEO, as kind of being the go-to guys on these kinds of problems. So, what was IDEO's take when Ford approached on the problem?
Yeah, well, following what Dave was saying, I would say our role was to bring in a very human-centered design approach to what is viewed as a technical opportunity. Seems like there was a lot of possibilities, a lot of things that we could do with regards to information design and what drivers were seeing in the instrument cluster of their vehicles. And that was primarily the design brief that we got, was what is it that drivers really need to see in order to use the car better. So given onboard computers and all kinds of things that are available to us today, and to Ford engineers in particular, you can basically tell the driver anything about the car that you want. So it was our job to work with Ford to figure out what it was that drivers wanted to know. So really bringing the driver's perspective into the equation and getting a good sense of how we can make something that is desirable, that people want to see, that is not sort of shoving information in their face or stuffing a point of view down their throat. But let's find something that is meaningful and meets the drivers where they are. So we were really excited to hear about the project first of all, and then to actually get a chance to work on it was great. We started with just getting a sense of what capabilities Ford had, and it was pretty clear, obviously, early on. They had deep technical expertise in what they were doing, and just basically how does IDEO play in that role? What role do we play to help them get to the place that they want? So bringing that human perspective and an approach and a process to get to some new and innovative concepts was what we helped with. It was a lot of fun.
So this is always the interesting challenge, right? When you've got a large corporation who's been working on a problem, and then you bring in the outside collaboration. So talk to me a little bit about how the collaboration worked between Ford and IDEO, both Dave and Steve. Give me each of your sides of perspectives of how you think the collaboration, what worked, what didn't work, and how did the process overall allow you to deliver kind of a 1 + 1 = 3?
Yeah, Dave and I were just speaking about this a while ago. The collaboration itself, I thought, was really fruitful. We have a design principle, just kind of an overall method to our approach, which is extreme collaboration and radical collaboration, and getting the client really involved. So even from the very outset, when we went out and talked to people, we identified some extreme users and some analogous users we wanted to speak to and get a sense of what they were seeing in the world, understand sort of the context on how they were, what they were experiencing with their car. Ford people were there with us the whole time. The whole core team went out on different observations, asked questions, participated. We brought back a lot of insights, and they helped us synthesize those. We locked ourselves in a room for about a week and prototyped together. And that was really important because we know, at least IDEO knows, that we're not going to have the deep technical expertise that Ford does. And how can we, instead of trying to replicate or replace that, let's just leverage it. Let's use that and the great design team that they have internally as well, and find a way to bring all of that to bear on this opportunity that we see.
So, Dave, what's your take on how the collaboration went?
Well, I mean, as Steve mentioned, I mean, it was, I think, very amazing for us in terms of just the kind of really integrated team that we ended up building from the two companies. And I think, part of what happened was the five of us from Ford that worked with IDEO were kind of given the opportunity to kind of work on this project kind of on our own without needing to kind of integrate that into the larger corporate structure. So for the 3 months or so that we were off working on this, we were kind of a team of IDEO and Ford, independent of kind of the larger structure at Ford, and that kind of really allowed us to spend a lot of time getting some really amazing work done together.
How important was that? Because that's kind of the common theme you hear about. Look, I'm in a large Fortune 50, Ford's big. When you want to go do these things, you just said, you went off, kind of carved it out separate from the rest of the Ford. How critical do you think that was to the success of the overall program?
I have a hard time imagining it happening any other way. I mean, to be honest, it was, from my perspective, when we, brought the work that we had done collaboratively back from the group of 9 of us, with IDEO and Ford, and kind of brought it back to Ford and kind of started to move into the next phases of actually getting it out to production. A lot of the work from my perspective was kind of trying to keep too many cooks from getting into the pot, right? I mean, it was just a lot of people that had lots of ideas, and we spent a lot of time defending the insights that we had gained from working with IDEO. And I think because of that, if we hadn't been kind of carving out the project from the beginning and kind of trying to continue that throughout, I think we would have ended up with something much less useful to the actual customer in the end. I wish I could look at that and say, yeah, we could turn this into an internal Ford process and just kind of put a structure around it and kind of do it over and over again. But I think in many ways, a lot of the success, a lot of the kind of details that we got into this never would have made it through if we'd had, designed by committee in the end, I think.
Well, I think that's kind of the history that a lot of the innovators and large organizations deal with, right? Which is the whole challenge of the internal processes being very efficient for large organizations, but when you try to do these breakthroughs, Steve, I'm sure you've seen that with other clients for IDEO as far as needing to do these kind of carve-out teams to really get that focus and drive the process without having, as Dave said, too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah, and I was going to build on what Dave was saying there. We see that quite a bit because what we want to do is not just design solutions that may or may not take hold. We really want to understand how ideas get through the organization and make sure that these things get to market and have an impact on business. So early on, I guess I can talk about one specific story, and that was how do we engage the Ford internal design team? Because obviously they have some very talented designers, and in fact, one of them was on our core team. And we didn't want to, what we wanted to capture as the core team working on this program was the interactions that we wanted to see in the car. We didn't want to get so detailed that we were designing the visual interface of what was going to actually be on the instrument clusters. We wanted to get to a point where we captured the interactions. Then the Ford design team can take that and make it their own. They know how to make something look like a Ford instrument better than anyone, so let's leverage that and make sure that that's what happens. So in order to get those interactions just right, we not only needed to have sort of human observations and insights, we needed to have that deep technical expertise of what was possible, someone in the room to help guide us in our design thinking and get us to the right concepts.
Well, this gets down to an interesting question, which is, so you captured that and then you define it. What was the process of validating those ideas? I know everybody's kind of into the whole prototyping stage. Prototyping has kind of different levels of sophistication. And so how did the core team, drive from kind of those early findings to then drive to that validation that what was being worked on was really going to be of value to the end customer?
Well, I could probably speak to the early stages of prototyping, and then Dave could probably talk about the later validation stages. But early on, it was more inspirational and not validative. You can look at prototyping in three different ways. You can look at, all right, what do we want to build? What inspires us to build something? The next one might be sort of evolutionary or evaluative. How do we know that these are the right things that we want to go further on? And then the last stage being, all right, we have these concepts. How do we know what we want to roll out first? And that could be more validative and making sure it makes sense to the end user. So starting off, we just did really rough prototypes. We didn't build anything elaborate. We didn't do anything digital. We just scratched things out on Post-its based on what we heard from people in the world. We went out and talked to 24 different people or thereabouts, extreme users, analogous users, and just heard what they had to say, integrated those insights, and then tried some things. We also gained inspiration just from what David and his team had brought to the table too. They had some technology they'd been working on called, very humbly, the Watson meter, and we took that and what technology was available there, and use that as inspiration to think, okay, how can we really connect with people based on what they're telling us out in the world? And so very rough prototypes, and a lot of them, hundreds of them, and eventually whittling it down to the ones that made sense for us based on our intuition and what we saw in the world. Then we were ready to start converging and understanding which ones we wanted to move forward with first. I don't know, David, if you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so there was that kind of prototyping that happened with the IDEO process. And I think one of the things that was really valuable there was that, the IDEO team in particular, they weren't engineers, although there were people from engineering backgrounds on the team, but they really kind of had this unique perspective. They were kind of unbiased from this kind of traditional automotive engineering experience. And so the kind of refinement that happened within that space was really valuable and kind of really pushing forward the ideas that the customer research kind of pushed forward. So that was really valuable. And I think the other thing, going back to your previous question a little bit, the other thing that came out of that process was some kind of framework. So one of them in particular that came out was this idea of the vehicle as a coach. And it was a really, I think, important insight into how we thought about what the instrument cluster was supposed to be doing. So rather than, someone who's nagging you and telling you to get better fuel economy, the idea was that it was a coach that kind of met you where you were. Steve talked about this a little bit earlier, but we saw that not every customer we talked to really wanted to be really pushing things to the max. I mean, some of them were very happy to have bought a fuel-efficient car, and that was a significant, commitment on their part, and that was kind of the end of the experience for them. They wanted a pleasant car, they wanted it to be nice, they wanted to show it off to their friends, but they weren't necessarily interested in spending a lot of time. And so we kind of had these frameworks that we could look at and kind of use that to keep focused on what we were trying to do. And I think that really helped in the sense of having some really good customer insight and kind of moving it out into the larger corporate space. Having that focus really kind of helped us keep things in line. The other thing that I think was extremely helpful in this project was that as part of this effort, we kind of prototyped internally kind of a new process for kind of modeling user interfaces up front. So we actually, this was kind of one of my large roles on the team, was building up with a group of other people a model of the instrument cluster kind of as we were defining it. So one of the things we were able to do was take static images that we got from IDEO to begin with, and then later that were refined by our internal design guys, and start animating them, and in fact driving them with actual real data. So when I was doing stuff on my desktop, I had a trace file that one of the engineers had gone off and collected for me from a real vehicle. And so I was able to look at the gauges as they would animate in the real car to very high fidelity. And the other thing that we were actually able to do is we were actually able to put that in Ford's full motion simulator called Vertex, and drive it off of a real model of a hybrid powertrain. So we had naive customers come in, essentially not outside customers, but people from Ford that were into hybrids and had never seen any of this work before, had never been involved in it before, and actually get them to drive a vehicle with the instrument cluster in front of them and get their feedback. And that was an extremely valuable process as well in terms of taking the ideas that we had and kind of refining them into something that was useful. And I would say for the most part that was more about taking the kind of concepts that we had developed and prototypes with IDEO and kind of refining them into something that actually worked in the vehicle. I don't know that it was so much about inventing new ideas as it was about just figuring out a way to kind of convey the information to the driver in a way that they understood and actually got and made sense to them.
Well, Dave, I think that brings up a good point, because if I recall correctly, reading some of the background material on the work that Ford and IDEO did, you actually went out and you're using aviation cockpit software to do the simulation. So rather than inventing something, you're leveraging something from a completely different industry to give you that simulation experience.
Yeah, and this software is is extremely valuable in terms of building up something that looked really close to what we were putting into production. In fact, that model that we ended up building up was actually handed off to the supplier to say, here's what we want it to look like, here's what we want it to look like when it animates. And I think that was very critical to actually, getting the product out on time and getting something that was useful. One of the things, one of the challenges in designing something like this in a large environment is that, we may think that we've gotten the best thing in the world, but we don't necessarily, those of us that are young and working on this kind of a project for the first time don't necessarily have all the experience that some of the the management team has. And so they would, we would show this to them, and they would have concerns and ideas for things we could do to fix it. And, it was really valuable to kind of get that in front of them in a way that they could actually see it moving in a simulated vehicle environment. And so that way we weren't handing it off to supplier and then looking at it 6 months later and saying, oh, this is never going to work. So it was really, really valuable experience to be able to do that kind of stuff.
So the question is okay, you've done the simulation, you've now put it into this Vertex. What happens after that? Were you able to say at the end of Vertex that you've got it figured out and could go to production, or what's the process after you've had these people drive around in the simulated vehicles with the actual new smart gauge working for them?
So it was actually much more interactive than you just described. So in fact, we would put concepts in front of people. It's actually 3 separate studies we kind of did. And literally there would be times when we would make a new idea, make up a new concept on how to display something to someone. We'd put it in front of a person and have them drive it. And it would be clear from the beginning that they completely didn't get the idea that we were trying to convey, and it just was never going to work no matter what we did. And so we would go off and literally make changes while the next person was driving, and by the third person, we'd have a new design up in front of them to test out. So it was an extremely interactive process. We were making lots of changes made to the model as we were running along. And so by the end, we felt pretty confident that we had something that was useful because we had made so many iterations, and by the end, we were starting to get people to really understand what we were conveying to them. So,
well, one of the things I find unique, when I look at and talk with people about programs that they're driving that are highly innovative, is really trying to uncover kind of those unspoken needs and those unspoken wants of customers. And I don't know if you've seen this, but I've seen in other cases where during that iteration process, you have that ability to kind of unlock the hidden drivers. I mean, for instance, in your case, you mentioned it early on, but also reading the background material here, you talk about the fact that, you got drivers in there who are kind of using the information that you're giving them to actually as a little bit of a competition. How many miles per gallon? Can I get another tenth of an MPG on this car if I drive a little bit better? Talk a little about that discovery process. I'm guessing that through the process of those iterations, there was a couple of aha moments on things that were, that the customers really zeroed in on, or the customers were pleasantly surprised and really hadn't anticipated themselves.
Off the top of my head, I would say that a lot of those kind of insights came through in the IDEO process.
Mm-hmm.
I think really the ethnographic research that we did with IDEO was really discovered a lot of those kind of things. And I think the stuff we did in Vertex in the end was much more about refining the presentation than necessarily discovering those kind of key insights to how people use the vehicle.
Yeah, so I'll just add on to that. The way we went out seeking those insights was, and we've just talked about this a little bit, but going out into the world and observing people in the context of their lives. So we weren't doing polls and surveys asking people what they wanted to see in the car, because oftentimes they're unable to articulate those latent needs that you're referring to. One way we try to get at those is by talking to extreme users. So extreme users are no different than, say, users in the middle of the bell curve. They just are more passionate or more intimate with some of the knowledge that we want to uncover. So you could look at a hypermiler who's keeping spreadsheets on every single gallon of gas that he's used over the last 3 years. And you can understand better, what is it that he's using in order to equate his driving with fuel efficiency, and you can get some insights there. On the exact opposite extreme, you can go and talk to a Hummer driver like we did and understand why they're not thinking about fuel efficiency and what are those opportunities where we could engage them in that conversation. And then similarly, we could go to analogous users, so looking at maybe industries that are close to or adjacent to hybrid technology, or maybe actually may have nothing to do with it, but we talked to some extreme athletes just to understand how do they monitor their caloric intake and how do they know when they're performing well, how do they know during practice that they're actually progressing And that was one where we just kind of discovered, I don't really need data to tell me that. I need a good coach. And that's something that stuck throughout the rest of the process. And we kept seeing that come up over and over again, this whole notion of coaching rather than informing as a way to start developing better driving behaviors.
So one question is, a lot of people have this view of innovation process and innovation cycles as just being a lot of this iterative and what's the real value or impact. Could you talk a little bit to, what you think the impact from start to finish on the overall time for the project? Was it about the same as a normal process? Was it faster? Was it slower? What was the impact of taking this kind of collaboration approach to solving this particular problem? What was the impact on the overall timeline?
So, if I remember correctly, and I could be completely wrong about this, but it was definitely a much shorter time period. But I believe some of the internal work started happening after traditionally a program would have had a first prototype built. So we were, I think, kind of starting to kind of come up with ideas very, very late in the program. And from my perspective, we couldn't have in that amount of time frame come up with something this large of a difference versus what we've been doing in the past. I mean, really kind of working with IDEO kind of gave us an incredibly large jump start. It brought some really fresh eyes to the process, as well as, the process itself of how to do the work and get the insights and to do the prototyping. And, like I said before, part of it too, this idea of carving out the team, I think, was really important in terms of getting decisions made quickly and efficiently, of having a small core group of people that were really highly involved and kind of just running with it as fast as they could.
Dave, your point then is that the process changes to where you're doing the upfront thinking first before you're jumping in and trying to solve the question. I mean, typically, in an engineering exercise, we've all lived through that, right, where everybody wants to jump in with the answer. It sounds like in this case the process was, let's think about it, use the IDEO process, and then that actually helps shorten the cycle from the standpoint of the iterations and the prototyping stage later on.
Right, and we had a lot of, we could, when people were trying to add those ideas in and kind of say they had the insight, we really had a strong base to start to go from, to say, yes, that's a very valid point, but, here's the insight that we had. We talked to this person and they said these things, and we really think that's representative and important to kind of address those needs. Mm-hmm. So one of the stories I tell very often about this is that the SmartGauge actually has 4 levels to it, and the kind of simplest level on the cluster, I think, is called Inform. And it has very little information on it. And that kind of is traditionally viewed as being something that is there for people who aren't really technical people, who don't want a lot of information. But, it goes back to one of the really eye-opening experiences for me in terms of collaborating with IDEO. One of the people we talked to was an extremely technical person from Silicon Valley who, worked in a high-tech company and was a computer guy and did all sorts of really cool stuff. And he drove a Prius, and he told us that, he turned all the screens off in his car because he understood how it worked. He had spent 2 weeks kind of learning the ins and outs of his vehicle, and he really kind of got it. And from then on, he could kind of feel what was going on, and he didn't need any information visually to kind of really understand what the vehicle was doing. And that kind of information was just not relevant to the experience he wanted to have in the car. And so that was one of the things that I pushed for really hard, to say, look, this isn't ignoring the kind of extreme users and the people who really care a lot about these cars. This is really directly for that kind of need, as well as for the drivers who kind of don't want all that information, to be able to escape to an information level that's much simpler and much less in your face, and just kind of allowing you to kind of focus on something else rather than, interacting with your vehicle so directly.
Well, I think this whole layering thing is important, right? Because we all suffer from the information overload problem, right, with the amount of data that gets presented. But in a car, it's a unique problem, though, isn't it, from the standpoint of distraction factor? You don't want to. How do you balance between the right level of information, but yet not causing a huge amount of distraction where people are focusing too much time on the gauge and not on the road?
Right. It is an extremely important, as we've seen with all the the presentations to Congress and all this kind of stuff, it is definitely something that we as a car company are always very concerned about, and just as individual people as well, we want to get this right. And really, I think the different layers are the different levels that the cluster comes up with is something that we prototyped with IDEO, and I think it is meant very much to address that need as well as kind of this coaching need. So I think we talked about it very much as, a coach kind of encouraging you to continue to evolve and to get better and to have new experiences with the car. But at the same time, it is kind of an opportunity for the driver to say, hey, I don't really want all this information at this time, or maybe I do. Maybe this is a time when there isn't a lot of other stuff going on, and I want to be more engaged. So that is very much meant to address some of those issues as well.
Yeah, one story I often tell is we went out and talked to people, and we brought some blank dashboards and said, draw us your ideal dashboard. And almost unanimously, the first thing people drew was a clock, which I think was not entirely expected, but it just went to prove that, look, sometimes people have other cares or concerns other than how much fuel efficiency they're getting. Sometimes they just really need to get there on time. So let's pay attention to other needs they might have in the car as well. And there are a few concepts that came out of that address, different needs at different modes of driving.
One of the unique things also about this is you're taking or leveraging, what today, for instance, in the computer industry is a pretty standard set of technologies such as LCD screens, and now bringing them into the car where they historically have not been a big play. What was some of the thinking on, talking about not only changing the experience, but also the level of technology integration? Obviously, LCD gives you a lot of flexibility on what gets presented, but any unique issues around that?
Well, I can certainly speak from the inspirational point of the project. It certainly opened up a whole new level of possibilities, and one we actually found in one of our observations again, where we were chatting with a guy who drove a biodiesel Hummer, I believe, and I'm still trying to figure.
Hold it. A biodiesel Hummer.
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of a strange combination?
It was kind of weird, but he had a couple of other cars as well, and he was telling us about one of the computers in, I think it was I'm not going to mention the car company. He was telling us about a computer in one of his other cars, and he was saying that by the time the car rolls off the lot, that computer is 3 years old, and it feels like it because it's just so slow. So he iterated over and over again, just give me something that I can upgrade in the field. Let me do something about this that, don't just let it be in the dash and be set and then be done. Give me some path to evolve or for the car to evolve with me. And that's part of where the levels David was talking about came from as well, is let's provide an entry point for people no matter what level of expertise that they're at. If they're beginners or if they're really, really really technically advanced in terms of hypermiling and fuel efficiency. Let's give them both entry points and access to the experience of this car.
Yeah, and I would add to that on the technical side. This is certainly something we've never done before as Ford, right? So there's certainly lots of things we want to be able to do, and there was all sorts of challenges with are we going to get LCD screens? Are we going to be able to actually put these in and find a supplier that can actually build all this stuff for us, because this is, very new technology. So absolutely there were technical challenges on the side, but, I think in the end we had a compelling story for why it was going to be useful to the customer, and fortunately we were able to take the leap and kind of to do it and see if it worked. And I think from my experience, it seems to have been a pretty big success, so we're pretty happy about that.
When you do one of these projects, there's obviously, you get to the end, you've delivered it, it's now in the car, you get kind of that satisfaction of seeing all that work result in something that actually customers are buying, and you go to the showroom and you can see customers get excited about it. When you look back on the whole project, and keep in mind, listeners of this podcast are people who are who want to be the innovators within their own organization. So I'll ask Dave and Steve, you should take a shot at this, but kind of, if you were to give the advice, if you were acting as a consultant to a company on kind of what are the 3 to 4 key things that organizations should think about when they take on a project like this, what would be kind of those 3 to 4 things? So Dave, we'll start with you first.
I think one of the key things from my perspective, and again, just to give you some sense of my background. So I, have a PhD in computer networking. I'm very much a computer guy, not a geek. I haven't worked for Ford for an extremely long time. This is one of the first big projects I worked on. So, I don't really know how Ford does it normally. That's something that I'm kind of learning now after having done this. But one of the things that seemed extremely important to me was getting the customer insight. I mean, I think we all had some sense of what the hybrid customer wanted and needed and desired in a car coming into this project. But I think that through the interviews we did with IDEO, we saw something completely different. And I don't know that it, was completely different than the experience. It didn't contradict what we kind of thought, but it really added a lot of richness and a lot more breadth as well as depth to kind of our insight into the customer. And I think that was really critical in terms of coming up with something that really met customers' needs in a way that would be hard to do without really getting that very kind of immersive experience and rich understanding of how the customer works. I think one of the other things that worked really well was kind of the diversity of the team. So in terms of just the Ford people that were brought to the table that kind of did this kind of core work with IDEO, it was a very diverse group of people. We had myself from research, my wife from the hybrid team. We had another woman from our kind of electronics team that would ultimately be responsible for kind of producing the cluster type stuff. We had a designer, and we had a guy from the ergonomics team. And, we all kind of brought very different perspectives to it. And then, on top of that, we kind of brought in the IDEO team, and they were 10 times more diverse than even that. And I think that really added a lot of diversity to the process. I think one of the things that happens a lot in these kind of projects is that you go off and do these brainstormings, and, as much as you try in a company like Ford, it's really hard to get a lot of different ideas into that process. And it doesn't say good things for being able to do this in a large company very easily, but I think really carving out small teams and kind of going off and trying to do something that's kind of leapfrogging and really far out there, I think is extremely valuable. I think we were all really passionate and really excited about it, and I think that helped a lot. And just being given the opportunity to kind of put our heads down and work really hard was pretty useful.
So Steve, what are your thoughts, given, you do these kind of projects, every day at IDEO, but if you were to give kind of the 2 to 3 things as an advice following a project like this to the next guys or listeners who want to go off and kind of do the breakthrough within their own business, what would that be?
Well, I think the most important thing would be let's ask the right questions. So many of these efforts are, especially with the technical breadth that this particular topic has, so many solutions go right to technology-based solutions immediately without really taking the time to consider, are we asking the right question and are we answering the right question for our users, or our consumers? And so I think we did a lot of that, especially within the research, and allowed ourselves to kind of get lost a little bit, which was maybe uncomfortable at some point in the process, but ultimately paid off, and we found some really interesting insights that we could act on. So asking the right questions is one. Probably another one is just being prepared to prototype. Oftentimes it's good to have those insights and have the conversations and start thinking about what it is we want to build. But if we just start building and learn from those prototypes, build many of them and just fail early and fail often in order to succeed sooner, as we typically say, we get to something much richer in a more timely fashion. So building and prototyping is very important. And then probably another one would be let's get beyond the things that we want to build, and let's start thinking about the new interactions and behaviors we want to see out of our users. What is it that people want to do? What unmet needs or needs, blatant needs that they have, and how can we help them get to these new driving behaviors that we and they desire in the car.
Well, that's great. Dave, one last question. You've now worked on this project. It's delivered. It's in a car. It's kind of a big milestone in your career. What do you do for an encore?
I don't know. It's a hard question to answer, but it was a big project and it was pretty impressive, and it was kind of outside of my normal day job. So it's a hard question to answer. I'm still kind of trying to figure that out. But the cool thing is that as a company, I think this is kind of the beginning of a lot of cool new innovations in the car, and I think Ford's kind of working on a lot of that kind of stuff. So hopefully we'll see things like this coming out soon after that.
Well, we'll stay tuned to see what you do come up with next. So again, Dave Watson, Steve Bishop, I want to thank you for your time on joining us on today's podcast. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us here.
This series of interviews with innovation thought leaders is made possible by support from thenextbench.com. For more information on the series and to listen to the previous episodes, visit thenextbench.com.
Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Please send your feedback. Particularly, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on doing these kinds of interviews. The objective is to give you a broader exposure to others that are out there creating killer innovations. If you found this podcast interesting and you want to connect with other innovators, join the network. There's killer innovation groups now in existence over on LinkedIn and Facebook and a variety of the social sites. Also, feel free to follow me over on Twitter. Just do a follow, Phil McKinney. Also, pay it forward. For those of you that are regular listeners of the podcast, you know that my sole objective in the podcast is to pay it forward as a return to my early mentors. And when I asked them how to pay it back, they told me later in my career to pay it forward to others. All I ask is that you pay it forward. Thanks for the time out of your busy schedule. Look forward to talking to you real soon. Bye-bye.